I'm here to speak about Islamophobia. We produced a report in November. You may know the Runnymede Trust has been around since 1968. It's our 50th anniversary this year. Our founders were involved in writing the first race relations legislation. And in 1997, so 20 years ago to the date that this was published, we published a report called Islamophobia. Wikipedia still blames us, as do many others, for inventing the term, or at least promoting it in the policy world. It's worth highlighting that there was a prior report, Commission on Anti-Semitism, that was produced in 1993, called A Very Light Sleeper, The Persistence and Dangers of Anti-Semitism. And one of the recommendations of that commission was that there should be a similar commission on Islamophobia. And so there were some shared commissioners there too. So some kind of Rabbi Julia Neuberger and Richard Stone and people like that. So 20 years on, of course, things have changed a lot, and I thought it was a good time, both because it's an anniversary, but also because since 1997, you might argue, I think plausibly, that Islamophobia has deepened and become, if anything, more pervasive across our society. So in this report, it's in sort of 3 sections. So that's the background to why we did this report and where it comes from. And it's worth noting we're a race equality organization, so we kind of have that sort of perspective on things. And I think that's also relevant actually in terms of thinking about messaging. I think especially the 97 report, one of the reasons I think it's stood up at the time is I think British Muslims very much felt under siege and that the state wasn't listening, that policymakers weren't paying any attention to these sorts of issues, that not only were they experiencing discrimination, but that the media was hostile, that government was disinterested, and that mainstream kind of white liberal society had no understanding or concern about Islamophobia. I think for the fact that Runnymede, with its sort of pedigree, was saying that Islamophobia indeed was a thing, and it was a thing that needed responding to as well as talked about and researched about, I think gave it added weight then in 1997. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, is that I go around explaining what this report is, and there are audiences of British Muslims who understand and get and want to fight it, but we have a bigger challenge in terms of getting wider society to see the persistence and extent and dangers of Islamophobia. So the first section of the report is what is Islamophobia, and I'm going to talk about that. That's the section I'm going to speak about. But the second section is worth highlighting, partly because it informs why it is that we've put out the definition that we have. The second section maps Islamophobia in various domains, so the levels of inequality that British Muslims experience in the labor market, in health, in terms of counterterrorism legislation, in terms of hate crime, in terms of integration, in terms of civil society activity, in terms of gender inequalities. So we sort of, one of the things that we've wanted to show is that Islamophobia isn't just a battle of ideas. It has real effects on people's lives. Muslims are being affected by Islamophobia in real ways in terms of their opportunities and well-being, and indeed psychological mental health. And there's no shortage of evidence of that. And in fact, the day before yesterday, the DWP published the recent households below average income data, and it suggests that over half of Pakistani and Bangladeshi children are living in poverty today, 52%. And you know I don't like to say things like this ordinarily, but I don't think that if the child poverty rate was 50% overall, that we would be seeing such inattention to it. When the DWP proposed to change the definition of child poverty to get rid of income and to include instead alcohol abuse, family breakdown, and educational attainment, I asked them, why do you think that's a good idea when the groups who have the highest rates of child poverty will miraculously become less poor? And they didn't understand what I was saying because they didn't know. These are people at the DWP that Muslims have the highest rates of child poverty. And that to me is damning because, do we really think that because Bangladeshi parents don't divorce, Pakistani children don't drink as much, and that their children are improving their attainment in schools, that all of a sudden those children are no longer poor? That is indeed what the government policy on child poverty currently says, that because Muslims don't divorce and drink as much, that therefore their children are somehow miraculously less poor. And I think, that's not true in terms of people's calories on the table or opportunities in schools and in the labor market. So what is our definition of Islamophobia? We've defined Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism. That's a short definition. We provide a longer definition, which is based on the United Nations definition on racism. By the way, I'm reading from, this is the report. It's available for free to download in full from our website, runnymedetrust.org. The longer definition builds on the UN's definition of racism, and we've done that because it's an existing definition, but also because the UK is a signatory on the Convention of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's a UN human rights treaty since 1968. So the UK agrees with this definition and agrees that in law and policy it ought to be followed. So Islamophobia is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction towards or preference against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims, because as we know, Sikhs and others experience Islamophobia, that has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights, fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Now, the reason that we've promoted the short and the long form is because we think that there's a lot of confusion about what Islamophobia is. You hear people even affirm that they are happy to be called Islamophobes. And what do they mean when they say that? What they mean is they're happy to say that they're scared of certain ideas or principles that they think or are in the Quran or the Hadith and various Muslim practices. But they wouldn't be happy to say, I'm an Islamophobe in the sense of discriminating against other human beings. So I think, and it'll be interesting to see how you respond, that we have to accept that criticism of ideas is indeed a hallmark of a free society. But discrimination against people, and against Muslims, is instead a sign of an unjust one. So what we need to foreground is the experience of that injustice and the need to tackle it. I think the other reason that we've kind of gone for anti-Muslim hatred, so we're talking about Muslims as opposed to Islam. Muslims are being, in their day-to-day lives, affected, because I think a lot of critics, especially on the secular left, that you were talking about, liberals, they sort of say, well, you know, we can criticize Islam, and they don't sort of then ask the further question, you know, what are the effects? What is the extent of institutional and interpersonal discrimination in Britain that affects Muslims in terms of having less likelihood of getting a job, less likelihood of having good mental health, less likelihood, higher health inequalities, and indeed, as I said, higher child poverty. So what we wanted to do there, and you've already referenced it, I think someone, the Saida Varsi's dinner table test, one of the alternatives of our definition is to refer to Islamophobia as merely anti-Muslim hate. And I say merely because I think hate is too narrow of a definition of racism. You focus, I think, merely on the hate crime on the street, and I think there's even a tendency there to suggest that, as with racism generally, the white middle classes are free from it, and it's just been sort of residualized in the sort of white working class communities in Britain. Whereas it's not the white working class who are designing budgets that hit the poorest Black and Asian women the hardest. It's not the white working class who are denying jobs to Black and minority ethnic people. If you're a Muslim, you have to send in twice as many CVs just to get an interview because of your surname. And it's certainly not the white working class that are giving white graduates 3 times as many firsts at university as they give Black graduates. So I think we need to think a bit harder about what racism is, about its extent and its experiences. And this is not merely some sort of sociological definitional thing. So obviously I've got a very elaborate kind of intellectual defense of why I've said this, but I think there's 2 other reasons to adopt this definition. The first is we need to reframe policy. We need to reframe the way in which policymakers understand and think about Islamophobia. Currently, the focus is merely on anti-Muslim hate. It is very much on counterterrorism and very much on hate crime. And I think that is... So I must sort of clarify, I think it's really important that the government calls out hate crime and has policies to respond to hate crime, and indeed that those of you in the room that experience hate crime report hate crime. But that's not where our entire policy focus should be. We should also be focusing on things like the labor market, that ultimately not getting a job or getting a job below your qualifications or getting made redundant or having worse appraisals from your boss are the things that sort of have the long-term knock-on effects for why, for example, Bangladeshis only on average have £15,000 in assets compared to white British people having £221,000 in assets. So I think that we need to focus not merely on hate crime for a variety of reasons. And one of the main ones is to re-center policy on those issues such as discrimination in the labor market, inequalities in health, racism and racial inequalities that will, I think, do more to benefit Muslim lives than anything else in terms of what policymakers could be doing tomorrow to reduce Islamophobia in Britain. Secondly, and I think it speaks also to what Rosie was saying, I think the focus on anti-Muslim racism also is bridging in terms of civil society, organizing with other anti-racist organizations, but also a wider human rights, social justice perspective that I think can link with other equality organizations. So I don't think there's anything wrong with any group to organize principally or primarily or first in terms of the discrimination that affects them. So if you're a Muslim, to organize as a Muslim in civil society is perfectly justifiable. After all, that's the discrimination and experience that you have in life. But I think there's two problems with that. First is if you don't go beyond that, if you just limit yourself to combating the form of discrimination that you experience, I think that you don't have a principled position. So I think if you adopt an anti-racist perspective, that has to be universal. You have to stand up and call out all forms of racism. And I think most Muslims do indeed do that. And in fact, I would say that it's been as much a challenge from the anti-racist sector too, who have misunderstood Islamophobia because of a slightly more left secular perspective that they've got. And I think that's one of the other reasons of defining it in terms of anti-Muslim racism. It better fits their understanding and indeed the sort of wider understanding of what inequality and racial discrimination looks like. So it sort of fits with existing civil society action against racism. But I think we need to demand that those who say they care about racism, why aren't you saying more about Islamophobia? Why are you sort of letting Islamophobia, and that's one of the reasons I think it's passed the dinner table test, is that liberals who in other circumstances would stand up for groups that would racially discriminate aren't doing enough to shout out and call out Islamophobia, including in their own households. I have some attitudinal data on this actually from the British Social Attitudes that looks at change over time in terms of racial prejudice. We published a briefing last, I think, December on this. And it's quite discouraging generally on the extent of racism in Britain. So 25% of people in Britain affirm that they're racially discriminatory towards others. And what's worrying is if you compare it especially to, say, gender rights or attitudes towards homophobia, where there's been a real sea change since the 90s, you don't see the same change. So the 25% figure for race has stuck since the 1990s. And more worrying maybe for some of you is that there's a question that's asked, would you be happy if your child married someone of a different background? And in general, it's quite shocking in the 1980s, how many white British people, like up to 80%, affirmed that they would be unhappy if their child married someone of a different ethnic background. And the positive, of course, is that's dropped well below 30% in most cases to 20%. The one exception is they've started to ask a question about would you be happy to have your child marry a Muslim? And that's now 50% of people in Britain would object to their child marrying a Muslim. At the same time where prejudice towards marrying, and you'll see that the survey is old by these categories, a West Indian or an Asian has declined since the 1990s. 44% in Britain, of people in Britain agree with the statement, some people were born less hardworking because of their race. So we've got a ways to go on racial discrimination, and I think in terms of organizing, as I said, I think this definition that we've tried to promote, and we're hoping that you will sort of see the value of it, allows us to frame Islamophobia in a way that connects, reframes policy to tackle things like inequalities in the labor market and in criminal justice, but also offers a new platform both for us to engage with wider civil society groups that are fighting against discrimination, including the work I think that Rosie's doing. I mean, I'll say one thing before I conclude. We're also doing some work on race and class, so looking at working class identity and trying to look at the multi-ethnic working class, and I'm happy to talk about that further. But I do think that, foregrounding some of the inequalities of voice and resource that have had, meant that there's not just left behind communities in the north of England, but in London, where the majority of, a large proportion of ethnic minorities, including Muslims, live. And then if you look at the child poverty rates, I find it quite shocking that after Brexit, that a supposed professor of political science could say that elite, leafy London areas, such as Tower Hamlets, Lambeth, Haringey, and Hackney, and he actually mentioned those boroughs, voted to remain, whereas the truly left behind voted to leave. Tower Hamlets has the highest child poverty of any local authority in all of the country. And yet, apparently, it's leafy and elite. Why? Because it voted Remain. I mean, we really need to do something to break down this absolutely incorrect empirically narrative, but it's also extremely divisive. As we see in Grenfell, you don't have to be 200 miles from Westminster to lack voice or resource. You can be a mile from the Houses of Parliament, or 2 miles from the Houses of Parliament, and our politicians are not listening to people who lack voice and lack representation, and have not been listened to either. So I've kind of got away from the topic of Islamophobia, but I welcome you all reading it. There is going to be likely a consultation from the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims and Islamophobia looking at this definition in the next year. So one of the reasons I've sort of emphasized the definition so much is I would hope that those of you in the audience would agree with our framing of it. I think there's a concern that government may choose to go down the anti-Muslim hate perspective, which I think would be very limiting. But obviously I'm here to listen to your thoughts about what you think about that, because what we, I think, don't want to see in the next year is multiple definitions being put forward so that the government can sort of say, well, the Muslim community are not of one view about this. We don't really know what our definition should look like. So I welcome debate and disagreement with me as well, but ultimately I think what we really need to do is refocus the public and policy debate on Islamophobia, and I hope that the definition I've offered shows you why that's productive. One final thing, I keep saying final thing, this report is on Islamophobia, so inevitably I think one valid criticism is, you've got a very negative report here. All you're talking about is bad things happening to Muslims. I absolutely agree that we need a lot of work, a lot more work on positive framing, positive messages about British Muslims, and that the British Muslim experience isn't all one of discrimination and disadvantage. But I'm not going to apologize for writing a report that sort of tries to outline what the evidence is when that evidence is currently so poorly understood. So I don't think this is the only thing that British Muslims should be working on in Britain today. I think that would be crazy, but I think we do need to do more on Islamophobia, both from the perspective of British Muslims, but of course from the perspective of wider society. Thank you.